In a railroad apartment on Mulberry Street in 1957, a grandmother from Calabria stood over a pot of water, dropping in stale bread and the rind of a cheese wheel she had been saving for 3 weeks. Her grandchildren sat at the table, and not one of them questioned why dinner smelled like a Parmesan factory. That was just how Tuesday worked. Today, most kids would not recognize half the foods that kept immigrant families alive in this country. Number 17 on this list was so common in Chinatown that the smell drifted through entire city blocks, and most American children today have never even seen it. Number 9 sat in a ceramic crock in the garage for months before anyone touched it, and number 4 required an entire goat. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 immigrant foods kids today will never understand. Number 25, schmaltz on rye bread. In every Ashkenazi Jewish kitchen on the Lower East Side, there was a jar near the stove. It did not look like much. Pale yellow, slightly cloudy, a little greasy around the rim. That jar held rendered chicken fat, and it went on everything. Rye bread with a thick smear of schmaltz and a pinch of salt was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. Butchers on Hester Street sold chicken skin by the pound specifically so women could render it down at home in a heavy skillet, stirring until the skin turned into golden cracklings called gribeens. Kids today see a jar of pale fat and reach for the trash can. In the 1940s and 1950s, that jar was the most important thing in the kitchen. It flavored soups, fried potatoes, and held together chopped liver. When margarine arrived and doctors started warning about animal fats, schmaltz quietly disappeared from most tables. But the grandmothers kept their jars. Number 24, tripe in red sauce. In Italian neighborhoods from Arthur Avenue in the Bronx to Federal Hill in Providence, tripe was Saturday food. The honeycomb lining of a cow's stomach simmered for hours in tomato sauce with garlic, bay leaf, and a rind of pecorino until it turned soft and almost silky. Butchers practically gave it away because most Americans would not touch it. Italian grandmothers bought it by the bagful and soaked it overnight before the real cooking even began. The smell while it cooked was unmistakable, sharp, and heavy, and it filled the whole hallway of a tenement building. Kids today see tripe and cannot get past the texture. In the old neighborhoods, that texture was the whole point. You ate it with crusty bread to soak up the sauce, and nobody called it adventurous. It was just food, the same food their mothers had made in Napoli. Number 23, congee with preserved egg. In the Chinatowns of San Francisco and New York, congee was the first meal of the day for working families. A handful of rice cooked slow in a big pot of water until it broke down into a thick, cloudy porridge. The preserved egg on top, dark green and amber with a faint sulfur smell, was the part that confused every non-Chinese kid on the block. Those eggs had been cured in clay and ash for weeks until the white turned to dark jelly and the yolk went creamy and gray-green. The taste was rich and mineral, nothing like a regular egg. Grandmothers made congee when someone was sick, when money was tight, or when the weather turned cold. 1 cup of rice could feed 6 people if you added enough water. That math mattered when every dollar counted. Number 22, head cheese. In German neighborhoods across Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and Yorkville on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, head cheese appeared at every holiday table and most weekday lunches. It was not cheese at all. It was the meat from a pig's head, slow cooked until it fell apart, then pressed into a loaf with the natural gelatin from the skull holding it together. Sliced thin and served cold on dark bread with sharp mustard and a pickle on the side. German and Polish butcher shops kept it in the display case right next to the liverwurst. Kids today see that wobbly, translucent slab and want nothing to do with it. Their great-grandparents considered it a delicacy. The whole head cost almost nothing at the butcher. Every usable piece went into the loaf, the ears, the cheeks, the snout. Nothing was wasted. That was the principle behind almost every dish on this list. Number 21, Coal Cannon. In Irish households from Hell's Kitchen to South Boston, coal cannon showed up at least twice a week. Mashed potatoes folded together with cabbage or kale, a well of melted butter pooling in the center. It sounds simple because it was simple. That was the entire point. Irish immigrant families in the early 1900s were feeding large households on wages from dock work and factory labor. Potatoes were cheap. Cabbage was cheaper. Together with butter, they made something warm and filling that stuck to your ribs through a 12-hour shift. On Halloween, some families hid a coin inside the coal cannon. Whoever found it in their portion got good luck for the year. Kids today might call it a side dish. In those kitchens, it was the whole meal, and sometimes it carried all the hope the family had. Number 20. Stuffed grape leaves. On Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, Lebanese and Syrian families turned grape leaves into an art form that took an entire afternoon. The leaves came from the backyard if you had one, or from a jar at the halal grocery if you did not. Each one was laid flat, filled with a spoonful of rice mixed with lamb, mint, lemon juice, and allspice, then rolled tight, smaller than a finger. A single pot held dozens of them, packed in rows with sliced potatoes on the bottom to keep them from burning. The smell of allspice and lamb fat filled the apartment for hours, while the pot simmered on low heat, the lid sealed tight, steam escaping from the edges. Mothers taught daughters the roll. You pinched the stem end, folded the sides in, and rolled it away from you in one motion. If the leaf tore, you started over with a new one. If the roll was too loose, it fell apart in the pot and the rice scattered into the broth. If it was too tight, the rice could not expand, and the center stayed crunchy and raw. Getting it right was a skill that took years of practice, and every woman in the family judged every other woman's rolls without saying a word. The tightness, the uniformity, the way they held together when you lifted one from the pot with a spoon. That told you everything about the cook. Kids today can buy them in a plastic tray at the grocery store, pre-made and uniform. They have no idea what it took to make a pot from scratch, or why the grandmother got quiet when she saw the store-bought ones sitting on her table. Number 19. Liverwurst on pumpernickel. German immigrant families kept liverwurst in the icebox the way other families kept milk. It was a smooth, spreadable sausage made from pork liver, and it went on dark pumpernickel bread with a slice of raw onion and yellow mustard. In the German neighborhoods of the Midwest, delis sold it by the pound and sliced it to your preferred thickness right at the counter. School lunches in those households meant a liverwurst sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The other kids at school would look at the grayish-pink spread and the dark bread and make faces. But the kid eating it knew exactly what it was. That was home, packed in a brown bag. Today, liverwurst is still in some grocery stores tucked behind the bologna, but almost no child under 15 has tasted it. Number 18. Homemade pierogi. In the Polish neighborhoods of Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, Pierogi Day was an event that started before dawn. The kitchen table disappeared under sheets of rolled dough. Every woman in the family had a station. One rolled, one cut circles with a glass, one filled, one pinched the edges shut with flour-dusted fingers. The fillings were potato and cheese, sauerkraut and mushroom, or sometimes sweetened farmer's cheese for dessert. A single batch made hundreds. They went into boiling water first, then into a heavy pan with butter and sliced onions that had gone soft and golden. The smell of caramelized onion and brown dough was the smell of a Polish grandmother's house. Kids today eat frozen pierogi from a bag and microwave them. They have no concept of the production line that used to take over an entire kitchen for an entire day, or the arguments about whose dough was too thick. Number 17. Stinky tofu. In the Chinatowns of New York and San Francisco, street vendors sold fermented tofu from carts, and the smell announced them from a block away. The tofu had been soaked in a brine of fermented milk, vegetables, and herbs for days, sometimes weeks, until the flavor concentrated into something powerful. The outside was crispy from the fryer, but the smell was intense, somewhere between strong aged cheese and something that had been left in the sun too long. Kids from outside the neighborhood covered their noses and crossed the street. Kids who grew up with it dipped it in chili sauce and kept walking. That was the dividing line between belonging and visiting. If you knew the smell, you knew the neighborhood. Today, Most kids in this country have never encountered stinky tofu and never will. There is a kind of food knowledge that does not survive in recipe books. It lives in the hands of the person who made it, in the timing they learned from watching, in the ratios they never measured. When that person is gone, the dish changes. It might still exist on a menu somewhere, spelled correctly, photographed nicely. But the version that came out of that specific kitchen, in that specific apartment, seasoned by that specific pair of hands, that version is finished. That is what kids today will never understand. Not just the food, the fact that it belonged to someone. Number 16. Borscht. In the Russian and Ukrainian neighborhoods of Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, borscht was not a special occasion soup. It was what you ate on a Wednesday when there was nothing else planned. Beets, cabbage, potatoes, sometimes a piece of beef shank if the budget allowed, all simmered together until the broth turned a deep magenta that stained everything it touched. A spoonful of sour cream on top and a chunk of black bread on the side. The beet stain on the wooden spoon never came out, no matter how many times you washed it. The kitchen smelled like earth and vinegar. Some families served it hot in winter, cold in summer, with a boiled egg floating in the center. Either way, the pot was enormous because borscht was always made in quantity and eaten for days. Kids today might recognize the color but not the taste, and certainly not the purpose it served. Number 15. Pho made from scratch. In the Vietnamese enclaves of Orange County and Houston, pho was not a restaurant dish. It started at 5 in the morning with a trip to the Asian grocery for beef bones. Those bones went into the biggest pot in the house with charred onion, charred ginger, star anise, cinnamon bark, and fish sauce. That pot simmered all day with the lid cracked. The broth turned amber and clear, with a thin layer of fat on top that caught the kitchen light. By dinner, the whole house smelled like a different country. The noodles were fresh from the shop on Bolsa Avenue or Bel Air Boulevard. Everything else went on the table in separate plates: the bean sprouts, the Thai basil, the lime wedges, the sliced chili. Kids today order pho at a restaurant in 15 minutes. They do not know what it means to start a pot at dawn and wait until dark to eat. Number 14. Tongue sandwich. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Jewish delis served beef tongue that had been simmered for hours until it was tender enough to slice thin against the grain. The tongue came whole from the butcher, and it looked exactly like what it was. A full beef tongue, thick at the base, tapered at the tip, with a rough, bumpy surface that had to be peeled after cooking. The peeling was the part that made children stare. You pulled the outer layer off in sheets while it was still warm, revealing the smooth pink meat underneath. Sliced thin and stacked high on rye bread with spicy brown mustard, tongue was one of the great deli sandwiches of the early and mid-20th century. Katz's on Houston Street sold it by the pound. The Carnegie Deli Uptown served it stacked high enough to need a toothpick to hold it together. Neighborhood delis on every block between Houston and Delancey had it behind the counter in a steam tray next to the pastrami and the corned beef. The flavor was rich and deeply beefy, softer than brisket, almost velvety when the slicer was set thin enough. But the name killed it for most kids outside the neighborhood. Tell a child they are eating tongue and watch their face change. Tell a grandmother from Orchard Street the same thing, and she would ask you what else you expected to find at a proper deli. That disconnect between the deliciousness of the thing and the horror of its name is exactly what every food on this list is about. Loved by the people who knew it, rejected by the people who only heard about it. Number 13. Black pudding. In Irish immigrant households from Dorchester to Woodside, black pudding showed up at breakfast next to the eggs and the soda bread. It was a dense sausage made with pork blood, oatmeal, and sweet, sliced into thick rounds and fried in a hot pan until the outside was crisp and the inside was dark and crumbly. The blood gave it a deep, almost mineral flavor that paired with a fried egg in a way nothing else could replicate. Butchers in Irish neighborhoods made their own using recipes they brought over on the boat, and every family had a preferred shop whose version they swore was the best. Kids from outside the community called it disgusting without ever tasting it. Kids who grew up with it put it on their plate without a second thought. That gap has only gotten wider with every generation. Number 12. Lard bread. In the Italian bakeries of Arthur Avenue in the Bronx and on Worcester Street in New Haven, lard bread was a staple that most Americans today have never heard of. The dough was rich with rendered pork fat, folded with chunks of salami, sharp provolone, and cracked black pepper, then baked until the crust crackled and the inside was soft and savory with pockets of melted cheese. A single loaf could weigh several pounds, and it was dense enough to serve as a full meal with a glass of red wine. Families bought it fresh on Saturday morning, and it lasted through Sunday dinner. When vegetable shortening replaced lard in most American kitchens during the mid-20th century, lard bread started disappearing. The bakeries that still make it the old way are down to a handful, and most of them are run by the grandchildren of the people who started them. Number 11. Oxtail stew. In the Jamaican and Caribbean neighborhoods of Flatbush, Brooklyn, oxtail was the centerpiece of a Sunday pot that started early in the morning. The tail was cut into thick rounds, seasoned overnight, then browned hard in a heavy Dutch oven before being braised with broad beans, fresh thyme, allspice berries, and Scotch bonnet peppers until the meat slid off the bone and the sauce turned thick and dark as molasses. The collagen from the bones made the gravy almost sticky. White rice and kidney beans cooked in coconut milk went alongside. That meal took 4 or 5 hours, and the kitchen windows fogged up from the steam. Kids today see oxtail on a trendy restaurant menu and do not realize it was once the cheapest cut at the butcher counter, bought by immigrant families precisely because no one else wanted it. The pattern is always the same. The cut nobody wanted. The part of the animal everyone else threw away. The vegetable that grew wild and cost nothing. Immigrant families turned all of it into food that sustained entire neighborhoods for generations. And then the neighborhoods changed, the children moved to the suburbs, and the recipes slowed down. Not because they stopped tasting good, because the people who made them stopped being around to teach the next pair of hands. Number 10. Soda bread with bacon drippings. In Irish kitchens across the Northeast, soda bread was baked without yeast, using just buttermilk and baking soda to make it rise. The loaf came out dense and golden, with a thick crust and a deep cross scored on top that cracked open in the oven. It was good on its own with a cup of tea. But what kids today would not understand is what went on it. Bacon drippings. A jar sat on every Irish immigrant stove, filled with the rendered fat from the morning rashers, white and solid when cold, liquid and fragrant when warm. You spread it on the fresh bread like butter. The salt and smoke soaked into the crumb and made something plain into something that tasted like the whole kitchen. That combination, the simple bread and the pork fat, was breakfast for generations of Irish families in America. Number 9. Kimchi from the backyard crock. In the Korean neighborhoods of Los Angeles, particularly along Olympic Boulevard and throughout Koreatown, kimchi was not something you bought at a store. It was made at home in enormous batches once or twice a year during a communal process called kimjang that could involve the entire extended family. Napa cabbage was salted for hours, rinsed thoroughly, and packed by hand with a paste of gochugaru red pepper flakes, garlic, ginger, fish sauce, and fermented shrimp. The filled jars or heavy ceramic crocks went into the garage, the basement, or onto the back porch where the temperature was coolest. In the winter, the cold kept it fermenting slow and steady. In the summer, you opened the crock and the smell hit you before you saw the contents, sour and spicy and alive. Every Korean household had its own version passed down through the women of the family. Some added cubed radish. Some packed whole scallions between the cabbage leaves. Some used anchovy paste instead of shrimp and swore the flavor was deeper. The differences were subtle to an outsider, but every family insisted theirs was the correct way, and the argument never ended. Kids in the neighborhood grew up eating kimchi with every single meal, breakfast included. A bowl of steamed rice, a dish of kimchi, maybe a fried egg on top. That was the baseline. That was the floor of every day. Today, kimchi is sold in glass jars at mainstream grocery stores, and food magazines call it a superfood and a probiotic wonder. But the kimchi from the crock in the garage, the one that fermented for months and tasted different every week as the bacteria did their work, the one your grandmother adjusted by feel and never once consulted a recipe for, that kimchi is a different thing entirely. The store version is fine. The homemade version was personal. Number 8. Pickled herring. In Scandinavian and German immigrant communities across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, pickled herring was a pantry staple that no household went without. The fish came packed in brine or cream sauce in glass jars that sat in the back of the icebox year-round. At holidays and family gatherings, the jar came out, and the herring went on crackers or slices of dense, dark bread. The vinegar bite and the slippery, silvery texture made it an acquired taste, and most children acquired it young or never acquired it at all. Grandmothers ate it straight from the jar with a fork, standing at the kitchen counter. Kids today open the refrigerator, see the cloudy jar with the silver fish floating in milky liquid, and close the door again without touching it. Number 7. Sweetbreads. In Greek and Italian immigrant kitchens, sweetbreads were a common preparation that has almost vanished from the American table. They are not bread and they are not sweet. They are the thymus gland of a calf or lamb, soaked in cold water overnight, blanched, peeled of their membrane, and then fried in butter until golden and crisp on the outside. The inside stays creamy and soft, with a delicate, almost custard-like flavor that tastes nothing like muscle meat. Greek families in Astoria prepared them for Easter Sunday alongside roasted lamb. Italian families on Arthur Avenue served them with a generous squeeze of lemon and fried capers scattered on top. The name alone confuses kids today. The explanation of what they actually are confuses them even more. Number 6. Dried cod soaked in water for 3 days. Across Italian, Greek, and Scandinavian immigrant households, dried salt cod was a kitchen constant, especially during Lent and the weeks of religious fasting. The fish arrived stiff as a board and hard as a plank of wood. It went into a bowl of cold water in the sink, and that water got changed every 8 hours for up to 3 days to draw out the salt. The kitchen smelled like the ocean the entire time. Once rehydrated, the cod was flaky and tender, ready for frying into fritters, stewing with tomatoes, or baking with potatoes and olive oil. Kids today have never seen a piece of fish that needed 3 days of soaking before you could even start cooking it. The concept of planning a meal 72 hours in advance is foreign to a generation raised on delivery apps and 10-minute recipes. Number 5. Natto on rice. In Japanese communities on the West Coast and in Hawaii, natto was a breakfast food that divided entire households down the middle. Fermented soybeans, sticky and stringy, with an aroma that some people describe as earthy and nutty, and others describe as a pair of old gym socks left in a locker. You stirred it with chopsticks until the strings multiplied into a web, then poured it over a bowl of hot rice with a splash of soy sauce and a dab of yellow mustard. Japanese grandparents ate it every morning without discussion or ceremony. Their American-born grandchildren sometimes refused on sight, and sometimes joined in and never stopped. The reaction to natto was the first cultural fault line most Japanese American kids encountered at the breakfast table the moment they realized their morning looked nothing like everyone else's. Number 4. Whole roasted goat. In Caribbean, Greek, and Middle Eastern immigrant communities, a whole goat was the centerpiece of the most important celebrations of the year. In Greek neighborhoods from Astoria to Tarpon Springs, a whole kid goat turning on a spit over charcoal was the heart of Easter Sunday, the fat dripping and sizzling on the coals below. In Trinidadian and Guyanese households in Richmond Hill, Queens, goat curry required breaking down a fresh carcass at home, bone and all, the kitchen counter covered in butcher paper. The meat was marinated overnight in green seasoning, then slow cooked until it fell apart. The bones stayed in the pot because the marrow flavored the curry in a way nothing else could. Kids today get their meat in plastic-wrapped trays with no indication it ever had a shape. The idea of seeing the whole animal and then sitting down to eat it is something most modern children have never had to reckon with. Number 3. Injera with raw kitfo. In the Ethiopian communities of Washington and especially the Adams-Morgan neighborhood, injera was the plate, the utensil, and the bread all at once. The spongy, tangy flatbread was made from teff flour fermented in a bowl on the counter for days until it bubbled and soured. It was poured in a thin layer onto a hot clay plate called a mitad and cooked until the surface was covered in tiny holes like a sponge. Stews and spiced meats went directly on top, and you tore off a piece of injera to scoop up each bite with your fingers. Kitfo, finely minced raw beef seasoned with spiced clarified butter and a ground chili blend called mitmita, sat in the center of the platter. You ate raw beef with your hands, using fermented bread as your only tool. For kids who grew up with it, that was just a regular dinner. For everyone else, every single part of that sentence sounds impossible. Number 2. Chicken feet dim sum. In the Chinatowns of New York and San Francisco, chicken feet were a standard item on the dim sum cart that rolled between tables every Sunday morning. Braised in soy sauce, black bean paste, and sugar until the skin turned glossy dark brown and the tiny bones softened, they arrived in a small steamer basket looking exactly like what they were. You picked one up, put the whole foot in your mouth, and worked the skin and cartilage off the delicate bones with your teeth before spitting the bones into a bowl. The flavor was rich and savory, the texture gelatinous and slightly chewy. Chinese grandparents considered chicken feet one of the finest bites on the entire dim sum table. Kids from outside the community looked at the basket, saw the toes, and moved straight to the dumplings. The distance between knowing what chicken feet taste like and refusing to find out is the entire distance between an immigrant kitchen and a modern American one. Number 1. Day-old bread soup. In Italian kitchens, it was ribollita or pancotto. In Portuguese households, it was a corda. In Lebanese homes, it was fata. Across nearly every immigrant group that arrived in this country with nothing, there was a version of the same idea. You took bread that was too hard to eat, broke it into pieces, dropped it into a pot of broth or stock, added whatever vegetables or scraps were on hand, and cooked it low and slow until the bread dissolved into something thick and warm and filling. It cost almost nothing. It wasted nothing. It fed everyone at the table regardless of how many showed up. Kids today throw away bread when it gets stale. Their great-grandparents built entire meals around it, meals that tasted better than anything made from fresh ingredients because the old bread soaked up every drop of flavor in the pot. That single difference tells you everything about what has changed and what has been lost. The bread was never the point. The refusal to let anything go to waste was the point. And that refusal, that discipline, that quiet, daily insistence on making something from nothing is the thing kids today will never fully understand. Every dish on this list started the same way. Someone arrived in a new country with almost nothing, walked into a kitchen, and figured out how to feed a family anyway. The recipes did not come from cookbooks. They came from memory, from necessity, from the stubborn belief that no part of the animal and no scrap of bread should ever go to waste. If you grew up eating any of these foods, you carry something most people your age do not. You carry proof that your family survived and that they fed you well while doing it. Leave a comment and tell me which one of these your grandmother made.